She was only 3 years old. A child so small, so full of life, she still carried a favorite stuffed animal wherever she went. The kind of child who giggled at cartoons, who reached up with tiny hands to hold on to the adults she trusted. A child who should have been safe. But on this night, she wasn't. She was somewhere terrifying. Somewhere she should have never been. Surveillance cameras would later capture a moment so disturbing, so incomprehensible, that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand what they were seeing. There, in the dim glow of the hotel's pool lights, was the small figure of a child, thrashing. Her arms flailed, her tiny legs kicked wildly beneath the water. It was instinct, pure, desperate survival. She didn't know how to swim. She was drowning. And she knew it. The water was deep. Too deep for her. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. Her mouth barely broke the surface before slipping under again. She gasped. Choked. Fought to breathe. And just a few feet away, standing at the pool's edge, was the only person who could have saved her. But he didn't. He just watched. No lifeguards were on duty. The hotel guests were asleep. The front desk clerk had no idea what was happening outside. And her mother, just steps away, in her hotel bed, was lost in a deep sleep, completely unaware that her child was locked in a battle she could never win. For an excruciatingly long time, the little girl fought. But before her body could give up, before her mind could slip into unconsciousness, something happened. A hand reached into the water. The stepfather. But not to pull her to safety. Not to lift her out of danger. Instead, he did something unthinkable. He grabbed her. Pulled her up just enough for her lungs to taste air. Just enough for her to feel, for a brief moment, relief. And then, without hesitation, he threw her back in. Again. And again. And again. Over and over, her small body hit the water, each impact weaker than the last. At first, she fought. Then, her kicks slowed. Her movements dulled. Her energy drained. Each time she surfaced, gasping, desperate, clinging to life, he ensured she went back under. No one heard her. No one saw her. No one was there to stop it. The security camera, cold and unfeeling, captured it all. Silent. Motionless. The only witness to an act so cruel, so deliberate, it would shake an entire nation. By the time the night ended, a child would be gone. And a family, shattered. In the hours that followed, when the hotel's lights flickered on and the world around them woke up, people would ask the same questions we're asking now. Why? How could this happen? And most chilling of all, was this a tragic accident, or a premeditated act of something far worse? Tonight, we break down the shocking case of a stepfather who did the unthinkable. The haunting details of what really happened that night. The investigation that would uncover things no one saw coming. And the disturbing truth about what led up to it. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is almost too horrifying to believe. The human brain is wired to seek patterns, to make sense of the world around us. When something terrible happens, we search for logic, for explanations that fit within our understanding of how things should be. Accidents happen. Tragedy strikes. But sometimes, the truth defies reason. Sometimes, what unfolds is so unsettling, so incomprehensible, that it shakes us to our core. And on this night, inside an ordinary hotel, something unfolded that no one could have prepared for. A mother, exhausted from a long day, fell asleep in her hotel room. Her child, 3 years old, barely tall enough to reach the edge of a table, was supposed to be safe. She should have been curled up next to her mother, wrapped in a blanket, dreaming the way all children do. But outside, in the dim glow of the hotel's security lights, a very different reality was playing out. The cameras were silent, unblinking, capturing every second without emotion. A little girl, her small frame barely visible in the dark water, was struggling. Her arms reached out, frantic, desperate. Her tiny legs kicked, trying to keep her head above the surface. But she wasn't playing. She wasn't learning to swim. She was drowning. And the only person with her, the one person who should have helped, stood there, watching. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. But when authorities reviewed the footage, what they saw went far beyond a moment of neglect. This wasn't a case of a child slipping into the water while an adult was distracted. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was something else. Something more deliberate. More haunting. Because it wasn't just once. It wasn't just twice. Over and over again, she was thrown into the water. Her body hit the surface with a splash, sinking instantly, her little limbs flailing beneath the weight of her own fear. Each time, she fought to rise, to break through to the air above. And each time, he made sure she went back under. There was no panic in his movements. No urgency. No hesitation. Just the steady, methodical repetition of something that should have never happened. And with each passing moment, her struggle grew weaker. The fight inside of her, the instinct to survive, began to fade. Inside the hotel, just steps away, her mother slept, completely unaware that her daughter was outside, locked in a battle she could never win. By the time the night ended, the little girl's body would be pulled from the water, lifeless. And the world would be left with a single, horrifying question: was this the result of reckless indifference, or was it something much worse? Investigators arrived at the scene expecting to piece together an accident. What they uncovered, instead, was something far more disturbing. Because when they started asking questions, when they started looking into the stepfather's past, they found things no one was prepared for. Things that painted an even darker picture. And it wasn't just about what happened that night, it was about everything that led up to it. Tonight, we examine the chilling details of this case. The evidence. The investigation. The shocking discoveries that would emerge in the days that followed. And most importantly, we ask the questions that still linger. Could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs? And, what really happened on that night? Because when you hear the full story, when you see the puzzle pieces laid out in front of you, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear: this was no accident. Before that night, before the cameras captured a child's final moments, before the world would come to know her story, she was just a little girl. A child full of energy, laughter, and curiosity. A child who deserved a future. She was only 3 years old. At that age, the world is supposed to be a place of wonder. A place where every day is filled with small discoveries, where the scariest thing in life is the dark corner of a bedroom or a loud clap of thunder. 3-year-olds are not supposed to understand fear the way she did that night. They are not supposed to fight for their lives. They are not supposed to drown while the person meant to protect them stands by, watching. She was small for her age, delicate. But she was full of life. The kind of child who ran toward adventure, who found joy in the simplest things: a balloon, a favorite cartoon, the warmth of a hug. She had a laugh that made people smile, a voice that was still learning to form sentences. She was a child who loved to be held, to be close to those she trusted. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, because the man she should have trusted the most, was the one who betrayed her. Her mother had always wanted the best for her. A single mother at first, she did her best to provide stability, to create a life where her daughter felt safe. But life is never simple. And when a new man entered her life, everything changed. He came into their lives suddenly. At first, it seemed like a fresh start. A man who could provide. A man who could take some of the weight off her shoulders. A man who, at least in the beginning, seemed to care. But what happens behind closed doors rarely stays hidden forever. And as investigators would later learn, there were cracks in the surface long before that night at the hotel pool. There were warnings. Whispers. Small things that, at the time, might not have seemed alarming, but in hindsight, told a much darker story. Like so many women, the mother she was searching for love, for stability. She had struggled on her own, trying to make ends meet, trying to raise a child without the support she needed. And when he entered the picture, he seemed like the answer to a prayer. A man who could be a provider, a protector. Someone who could fill the empty space in her life. But love is blind. And sometimes, it is deaf as well. Sometimes, it silences the warnings that should be heard the loudest. Those who knew her say she was kind, soft-spoken, but often overwhelmed. She had always done her best, but life had not been easy. And when he came along, she wanted to believe that she had finally found something real. Someone to share the weight of the world with. She wanted to believe that he would love her daughter the way a father should. But love should never come at the cost of a child's safety. And as time would tell, there were moments, small, scattered moments, where she should have known something was wrong. As for the stepfather, the man who should have protected her, he was a man with a past. A man who, to those on the outside, seemed ordinary enough. A man who blended in. But those who knew him well, those who had been close enough to see beyond the surface, had seen something else. A temper that flared too quickly. A coldness in his eyes when things didn't go his way. A man who didn't take well to being challenged. And, most disturbingly, a man who never seemed to bond with the little girl who now called him Daddy. People noticed. Neighbors. Friends. Even family. They saw the way he was with her. Or, more accurately, the way he wasn't. He never played with her the way a father should. He never showed the warmth, the patience, the love. He was distant. Cold. And sometimes, there were flashes of something worse. There were times when his frustration would bubble over. Times when his voice would rise just a little too sharply, when his grip on her arm would be just a little too tight. Times when the air around him would shift, and those watching would feel the weight of something unspoken. But no one ever spoke up. Because nothing ever seemed quite serious enough. Because there was never a single moment, a single act, that screamed danger. Just a collection of small, uneasy moments that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than bad parenting. But bad parenting does not end with a child at the bottom of a pool. And when investigators started digging into his past, they found things no one expected. As the days passed after the incident, as detectives pieced together the timeline, as they went through witness statements and security footage, a clearer picture of the man began to emerge. And what they found changed everything. There was history. A trail of past behaviors that, in hindsight, painted a chilling portrait. Old police reports. Complaints from previous relationships. Allegations of control, of anger, of cruelty. But nothing had ever stuck. Nothing had ever been enough to put him behind bars. Nothing had ever been enough to stop him. Until now. Until a 3-year-old girl paid the price. By the time investigators were done with their findings, one thing was clear: this was no accident. And what happened next would shock the world. Because as the truth unraveled, as the pieces of the story came together, the question was no longer just about that night, it was about everything that led up to it. It was about how many times this man had hurt someone before. It was about how many chances had been missed. And, most importantly, it was about whether justice would be served. Because when the facts were laid bare, when the evidence was stacked against him, when the world saw what had really happened, one truth could no longer be ignored: this little girl never stood a chance. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. A quiet evening at a hotel, the kind where families check in after long road trips, where exhausted parents tuck their children into bed, where the hum of air conditioners and the distant sound of television sets fill the halls. But in one particular room, a decision was about to be made. A decision that would change everything. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The mother had put her child to bed, believing she was safe. Believing she would wake up in the morning to a day like any other. She had no reason to question what was happening just beyond the thin walls of her hotel room. No reason to suspect that, as she lay in bed, lost in sleep, her daughter was being led outside, into the night, into danger. But the cameras saw it all. It was late, long past the time any child should be awake. The stepfather had made the decision to take the little girl out of the room. Maybe she was half asleep, confused. Maybe she reached for his hand out of instinct, trusting that wherever they were going, it would be safe. But where they were going, was anything but. The hotel's security cameras captured their movements from the moment they stepped into the hallway. The little girl walked beside him, her tiny footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. She was dressed in nothing but a swimsuit. No towel, no flotation device, no sign that this was supposed to be a playful, late-night swim. They walked past closed doors, past rooms where families slept peacefully, unaware that mere feet away, a child was being led toward what would be her final moments. Outside, the air was cool. The pool area was dimly lit, the water dark and still. The kind of silence that should have been peaceful. But tonight, it would become something else entirely. The cameras recorded everything. There was no hesitation, no moment of uncertainty. The stepfather picked her up and dropped her into the deep end of the pool. The splash echoed, a brief disruption in the quiet night. Then, movement. Frantic. Desperate. The little girl surfaced, gasping, her arms flailing wildly as she tried to keep her head above the water. But she couldn't swim. She didn't know how. And for the first time in her short life, she understood what it meant to drown. She struggled, her small body twisting in the water, searching for something to hold on to. Searching for help. But the only person there, the only one who could have reached in and pulled her to safety, just stood at the edge of the pool and watched. She kicked. Fought. Gasped. And for a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he would finally reach in and grab her. Instead, he lifted her out. And threw her back in. Again. And again. And again. The first few times, she fought. Her body had strength, fueled by instinct, by the desperate need to survive. But no child can fight forever. Slowly, her movements began to change. Her kicks, once frantic, became weaker. Her arms, once reaching, started to sink lower. Each time she surfaced, she swallowed more water. Each time she went under, she stayed under longer. And still, he did nothing. He didn't reach for her. Didn't panic. Didn't show even a flicker of concern. He just stood there, watching, as her body gave up on her. The cameras caught everything. The moment she stopped reaching. The moment she stopped kicking. The moment the water stilled, and her small frame floated just beneath the surface. And then, the silence. It took seconds. Maybe minutes. But when it was over, he finally moved. He reached into the water, lifted her body out, and set her down by the pool's edge. But there was no urgency. No desperate attempt at CPR. No frantic screams for help. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who already knew she was gone. The hotel remained silent. No guests had seen it happen. No staff had come outside to check. And inside, her mother was still asleep, oblivious to the fact that her child was lying lifeless just outside her door. So he left her there. Walked away. As if nothing had happened. It wasn't until much later, when the night had stretched into morning, that reality would come crashing down. Someone finally found her. Maybe another guest, maybe a hotel staff member. But by then, it was too late. Panic erupted. The once quiet hotel filled with the sounds of sirens, the shouts of emergency responders, the desperate cries of a mother who had gone to bed thinking her daughter was safe. The 911 call was made. The details of that moment remain haunting. The voice on the other end of the line, trying to explain what they were seeing. A child. Unresponsive. Cold to the touch. No pulse. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the damage had been done. The little girl was rushed to the hospital, but the outcome was already decided. She had spent too much time underwater. She had struggled for too long. And the one person who could have saved her, never even tried. When the stepfather was confronted, his story was simple: it was an accident. A horrible, tragic mistake. He claimed she had wandered off, that he had only turned his back for a moment, that he hadn't realized she was drowning until it was too late. But there was one problem. The cameras. The silent, unblinking witnesses that had seen everything. And when investigators watched the footage, they knew, this wasn't an accident. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something that couldn't be ignored. The investigation was only beginning. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. But there were still questions. Why did he do it? What led him to that moment? Had there been signs before? And most importantly, would justice be served? Because when a child dies like this, when the truth is so clear, so undeniable, the world demands answers. And this time, there would be no denying what had happened. The call came in just after sunrise. A child. Found unresponsive. A hotel pool. The words were cold, detached, just another emergency dispatch, another voice over the radio. But when the first officers arrived at the scene, it didn't take long to realize, this was no ordinary case. This was something else entirely. The hotel lobby was eerily quiet. Guests, some still in pajamas, huddled near the front desk, whispering. Staff members stood frozen, their faces pale, their hands shaking. And outside, beyond the glass doors, was the pool, still and empty now, as if nothing had ever happened. But the evidence of what had taken place hours before was already waiting. And when officers made their way to the stepfather, they immediately noticed something that didn't sit right. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't distraught. There was no desperation in his voice, no signs of a man who had just lost a child under tragic circumstances. Instead, he was calm. Too calm. The stepfather's explanation was simple. He told officers that the child had wandered off while he was distracted, that by the time he noticed, she was already in the water. That he had tried to save her, but it was too late. That it was a terrible accident. But there was one problem. The security cameras. And when officers reviewed the footage, it was clear, his story was a lie. The footage didn't show a child slipping away unnoticed. It didn't show a frantic stepfather diving in to rescue her. It showed something else. Something impossible to explain away. They watched as he picked her up and dropped her into the pool. Over and over again. They watched as she fought, as she struggled, as she begged for air. They watched as she sank, and as he stood by, doing nothing. And when they turned back to look at him, standing in front of them, his expression unreadable, there was only one thought on every officer's mind: this was no accident. Inside the hotel, in one of the guest rooms, the child's mother sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her hands gripping the sheets as if holding on for stability. When officers asked her what had happened, she hesitated. Shook her head. And then, her voice trembling, she told them what she knew. She had been asleep. That was the first thing she said. She had put her daughter to bed, exhausted from the long day, and had no idea that, just steps away, her world was falling apart. But as the questions continued, her words began to unravel. The officers wanted to know more. Had there been signs? Had she ever noticed anything at all, that made her question whether her daughter was safe? And that's when the silence came. A silence that stretched too long, that filled the room with a weight so heavy it was almost suffocating. And then, finally, she admitted the truth. There had been moments. Small things. Times when she had wondered, when she had felt something she couldn't quite explain. A moment when she saw him grab the little girl's arm just a little too hard. A time when she saw her daughter flinch when he walked into the room. And then there was the way he never seemed to bond with her. The way he remained distant, cold. The way his patience wore thin far too quickly. She had told herself it was nothing. That she was imagining it. That she was just overthinking. And now, sitting in that room, with the weight of her child's absence pressing down on her, she realized the truth. She should have listened to that voice. She should have questioned more. She should have done something. While detectives continued questioning those involved, the child's body was transported to the medical examiner's office. The autopsy was routine. But what they found was anything but. The cause of death was drowning. That much was clear. But there were other things. Bruises. Faint marks along her arms, her back. Some fresh, some older. Signs of a struggle, yes, but also signs of something more. Signs that this may not have been the first time she had suffered. The findings painted a picture more horrifying than anyone wanted to believe. Because while the footage showed what had happened that night, the body told a different story. A story of pain that had started long before the cameras ever turned on. In the days that followed, as news of the tragedy spread, more people began to come forward. A hotel staff member remembered seeing the stepfather earlier that evening, his voice sharp, his patience thin as he spoke to the little girl. Another guest recalled hearing a child crying the night before, but they had assumed it was nothing, just a child being fussy, as children often are. No one had realized what they were really hearing. No one had known that, just hours later, that same child would be gone. The pieces were coming together now. The timeline was becoming clear. And as detectives pieced it all together, there was only one question left to answer: why? There are crimes that happen in moments of rage. Crimes that are the result of a split-second decision, a loss of control. And then, there are crimes that are something else entirely. Crimes where the actions are deliberate. Where the choices are made over and over again. Where there are opportunities to stop, to walk away, to change the outcome, but none are taken. The investigators needed to understand, was this an impulsive act, or had it been planned? Had there been a moment where the stepfather realized what he was doing and decided to continue anyway? Had there been any point where he had hesitated? The footage gave them their answer. Because when they watched, frame by frame, they saw it. The pauses between each throw. The moments where he stood over her, waiting. Watching. The moments where she had surfaced, gasping, and instead of pulling her out, he had lifted her and thrown her back in. This wasn't recklessness. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A choice made repeatedly, with every opportunity to stop ignored. When the stepfather was confronted with the evidence, when he was told what they knew, what they had seen, his reaction was not what anyone expected. He did not break down. He did not weep. He did not plead for forgiveness. He simply sat there. Expressionless. Silent. Unmoved. Maybe, deep down, he had already accepted his fate. Maybe he had known, from the moment he walked away from that pool, that this day would come. Or maybe, he simply didn't care. The investigation was nearing its end. The evidence was clear. The lies had unraveled. The truth was out. But one question remained: would there be justice? Because in the world of criminal cases, the truth is only part of the battle. The next step is what happens in the courtroom. By now, the truth was undeniable. The security footage had spoken. The evidence was there. The child had not simply drowned, she had been thrown, over and over, into the deep end of the pool, left to struggle, left to suffer, left to die. But there was one thing left to prove. One final question that would determine the outcome of everything that followed: was this an act of pure recklessness? Or, was it intentional? Investigators had already heard the stepfather's version of events. A tragic accident, he called it. A misunderstanding. He had simply been teaching her to swim, he claimed. She had slipped, he had panicked. He said all the right words, used all the right phrases, the kind that might have worked if there hadn't been cameras watching his every move. But as investigators dug deeper, as forensic specialists analyzed every frame of the footage, as experts broke down the evidence piece by piece, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern that pointed to something far more disturbing than a simple lapse in judgment. Forensic video analysts dissected the footage, frame by frame. They examined every movement, every hesitation, every moment where the stepfather could have stopped, could have pulled her out, could have done something, but didn't. And one thing became clear. This wasn't just an act of negligence. This wasn't someone failing to act in the heat of the moment. This was methodical. Repetitive. Cold. The first throw. The little girl struggles. The stepfather watches. The second throw. She surfaces, gasping, reaching. He does nothing. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Each time, she fights less. Each time, she slips under faster. And each time, he stands there, unmoved. Experts noted something chilling: he wasn't acting out of frustration. He wasn't reacting impulsively. He was waiting. Timing each moment. Standing still, watching, waiting for her to go under before lifting her again and repeating the process. It was controlled. Calculated. And then there was the moment that sealed it. The final time she went under. The moment when she didn't resurface. The moment when everything went silent. And he didn't react. He didn't rush to pull her out. He didn't call for help. He stood there. Watching. And only when it was too late, only when her body no longer moved, did he finally reach into the water. The experts had seen enough. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. This was something else. When confronted with the footage, the stepfather's demeanor changed. At first, he denied everything. He repeated his claim: he had been trying to teach her how to swim. It was an accident. A misunderstanding. But the investigators pressed on. They pointed out the inconsistencies. They asked the questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Why had he thrown her in repeatedly? Why hadn't he jumped in when she struggled? Why had he waited so long, before pulling her out? His story started to shift. First, he said he hadn't realized she was in danger. Then, he said he thought she was playing. Then, when pushed further, he claimed he had panicked, that he had frozen in the moment. But the footage told a different story. There was no panic in his movements. No hesitation. No confusion. Just deliberate, measured actions. And when the contradictions became too many, when the lies stacked too high, he stopped talking altogether. He knew the walls were closing in. And then, just when investigators thought they had uncovered the worst of it, another discovery was made. A past that had, until now, remained hidden. A history that painted a far darker picture than anyone could have imagined. Records surfaced. Old reports. Complaints. Incidents that had never resulted in charges, but now took on an entirely new meaning. Women from his past. Relationships that had ended abruptly. Stories of control, of anger, of violent outbursts. But most disturbingly, there were children. Other children. In one report, a former partner described a moment of fear, watching him grab a child by the wrist too hard, yanking them with a force that made her stomach turn. In another case, a babysitter recalled seeing bruises on a child's arm, the kind that didn't happen from normal play. And then, there was the most damning revelation of all. Years before this night, years before this child was left to drown, there had been another incident. Another moment where a child had been left alone in a dangerous situation. A moment that, at the time, had been brushed off as nothing more than carelessness. But now, in the context of everything that had happened, it wasn't just carelessness. It was a warning. A warning that had gone unheeded. Had this been building for years? Had the warning signs been there all along? And if so, could this tragedy have been prevented? By now, there were no doubts left. The evidence was overwhelming. The story had fallen apart. The past had caught up with him. And yet, even as the truth became undeniable, there was still one question that remained unanswered: would there be justice? Because in so many cases like this, even when the evidence is clear, even when the lies have crumbled, even when the horror of what happened is undeniable, justice is never guaranteed. The next step was the courtroom. The trial. The moment when the world would hear the full story. And in that room, a jury would have to decide. Was this man guilty of murder? Or would he somehow, despite everything, walk free? Because now, it was no longer about what had happened. That part was known. Now, it was about accountability. It was about consequences. It was about whether, for once, a child's death would not be written off as just another tragedy. Whether this time, the system would do what it was supposed to do. Because this time, the world was watching. The trial was set to begin. The evidence had been laid out, the witnesses prepared, the jury seated. And in the center of it all sat one man, the man who had watched a child drown, who had lifted her up only to throw her back in, who had stood motionless as she slipped beneath the water for the last time. In the days leading up to the trial, there was no shortage of opinions. The public had already decided, this was not an accident. This was not a moment of reckless indifference. This was something worse. And now, the court would have to decide the same. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out the case. The footage, the forensic evidence, the testimonies, each piece a damning reminder of what had taken place that night. And with every new detail, the charges against him became heavier. First-degree murder. That was what the state had pushed for. A charge that required proof of intent, of a decision made in full awareness of its consequences. But there was debate. Could intent be proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Could a jury be convinced that this was not just a man who had made a terrible, fatal mistake, but a man who had chosen to kill? The defense, as expected, pushed back. They argued that he had been careless, not malicious. That he had lacked judgment, not intent. That his actions were reprehensible, yes, but not murder. They suggested lesser charges, manslaughter, criminal negligence. But the prosecution stood firm. This was not carelessness. This was not poor judgment. This was cruelty, calculated and deliberate. And so, as the arguments unfolded, as the evidence was played and replayed for the jury, as the grainy footage flickered on courtroom screens, showing the small, helpless figure fighting against the water, the weight of the decision settled on the room. Would the system hold him accountable? Or would this be another case where a child's death was reduced to a mere tragedy, where no one was truly to blame? But the courtroom did not focus only on the stepfather. There was another question looming over the case. One that, for many, was just as pressing: what about the mother? She had not been in that pool area. She had not thrown her daughter into the water. She had not stood there, watching as life drained from the small body struggling before her. But she had been there, just a few doors away. Asleep. Unaware. And for some, that was enough. Should she have known? Should she have seen the signs? Should she have done something, anything, to prevent this from happening? There was no evidence that she had ever physically harmed her child. No proof that she had conspired with the man now sitting on trial. But there was neglect. That was what prosecutors argued. Not the kind that leaves bruises, not the kind that is easy to see, but the kind that allows something like this to happen. The kind that ignores warning signs. The kind that stays silent when it should have spoken up. And so, a second case unfolded, a case that asked whether a mother's failure to protect could be seen as a crime. In the end, the decision was made. The stepfather would stand alone in facing the most serious charges. But the mother, she would not walk away completely free. She would face child endangerment charges, though far less severe than what the man who had thrown her daughter into the water would face. The jury deliberated. Hours passed. Then a day. And finally, the decision was made. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom, final and absolute. The stepfather, who had sat still through most of the trial, finally showed a reaction. A flicker of something across his face, anger, disbelief, or maybe just the realization that, for the first time, his actions had caught up with him. The sentence was swift. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. A punishment fitting for a man who had watched a child drown and done nothing. And the mother? She would serve time, but far less. A few years behind bars. A lifetime of guilt. And when she walked free again, she would do so carrying the weight of a mistake she could never undo. The case ignited fury across the country. The footage, raw, unfiltered, impossible to forget, was played and replayed on news stations, dissected in courtrooms, whispered about in quiet conversations. People asked the same questions over and over. How could this have happened? How could no one have stopped it? How many other children had suffered in silence before this one was finally seen? The conversation expanded beyond this case alone. It became a discussion about child abuse laws, about hotel security, about the responsibility of bystanders. Could someone, anyone, have intervened? Could this have been prevented if the warning signs had been taken more seriously? There were petitions. Protests. Demands for stricter monitoring of child endangerment cases. And for weeks, the face of the little girl lost in that pool became a symbol. A reminder of the dangers that hide in plain sight. A warning that sometimes, the greatest threats do not come from strangers, but from those closest to home. The trial was over. The sentencing had been handed down. The world had moved on. But for those who had followed the case, for those who had watched the footage, for those who had seen the struggle and the silence that followed, one question remained. Why? Why had he done it? Why had no one stopped it? Why had a little girl, full of life, full of potential, been left to fight for herself against impossible odds? There are cases that fade from memory. Cases that become just another statistic. But there are others, cases like this, that never leave us. That haunt us. That make us wonder how many more stories like this are still unfolding, unnoticed, unreported, unseen. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, this was not the first time something like this had happened. And unless the world begins to listen, to act, to protect, it will not be the last. This case is one of the most chilling reminders of how trust can be shattered in the worst possible way. A child, innocent, vulnerable, left in the care of someone who should have protected her. A mother who believed she was making the right choices. A system that, perhaps, failed to intervene before it was too late. And a courtroom where justice was sought, but was it truly served? There are cases that make us uncomfortable. Cases that force us to look at the world differently. This is one of them. Because the truth is, tragedies like this do not happen in isolation. The warning signs are often there, small, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. And yet, time and time again, we hear the same story, no one saw it coming. But is that really true? Did no one see it? Or did no one want to believe it? Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the stepfather's actions were premeditated? Or was this reckless cruelty taken too far? Should the mother have been held more accountable? Or was she another victim in this nightmare? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring true crime stories daily that reveal the darkest corners of human nature, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover the stories that need to be told, the stories that remind us to question, to listen, to pay attention. Because sometimes, the difference between life and death is simply who is watching.